Hi, my name is McKenna Snodgrass from Missouri State University, and today I'm going to be talking about trauma-informed care in schools. I'm not going to go super in-depth about adverse childhood experiences because we have already talked about it in class, but just as a recap, ACEs are going to be any traumatic event that a child experiences from ages birth to 18 years old, and those can include things like emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, having a mom be in a domestic violence situation, having a family member be incarcerated or have a mental illness, things like that. And the range is on a score from 1 to 10. And 61% of people have reported, or adults have reported having at least an ACE score of 1. And 1 in 6 adults report having 4 or more ACEs, which is when your health outcomes tend to start really being impacted later on in life. And in the last year, 1 in 7 children have been reported to be abused or neglected. So, based on those statistics and what we have learned in class so far this semester, do you think that teachers are prepared to educate children who have endured trauma? This is including addressing behaviors in class, knowing up-to-date information about child abuse and neglect, knowing how to handle a disclosure. Do you think that they are being properly trained for that? Unfortunately, most of our teachers are really not prepared to begin teaching and helping a child that has endured traumatic events. 89% of teachers could at least identify one person or one child in their class that had experienced a trauma or had a traumatic childhood, but only 9% reported having a trauma training in the last 3 years. So when we talk about trauma training, it's not just, facts and figures about child abuse and neglect. It's also training teachers on how to start addressing the social, emotional, the behavioral, and the cognitive outcomes, or things that the child is kind of showing in class. So 9% had received that training, but 91% hadn't. And that's a pretty big ratio considering 89% of teachers could identify at least one child in their class that had experienced trauma. So trauma in the classroom can look like a bunch of different things. There are social emotional outcomes. So this is going to be internalizing and externalizing symptoms. Internalizing symptoms could be showing signs of anxiety or depression. Externalizing symptoms could be things like poor impulse control, poor social skills, poor attachment. Behavioral issues are going to be things like having outbursts in class. A lot of clinicians are misdiagnosing children with ADHD instead of looking at their trauma background. So a lot of kids are going to have outbursts in class, are going to be hyperactive, can't sit still, are going to have a lot of dysregulation. And then you have cognitive issues, which are going to be things like having a low GPA, low attendance. Some of these different categories can interact with each other, so that you may have a child that's going to drop out or that has been expelled or suspended because of low performance in school, along with having those behavioral issues. So it's really important that we start teaching or training teachers on how to teach and care for these children whenever they're acting out in class, because they do have 20 other kids to take care of at the same time. So there are a bunch of other categories rather than just training teachers on child abuse and neglect that can be really beneficial to help the care or to help them care for these children. So the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration have come up with 6 key components of trauma-informed care, and 5 of these are really more addressing relationships. So having that child form good relationships with their peers and with their teacher, and what it takes to, you know, form those relationships and keep those relationships healthy. But I have included an example for safety, and this is more about the environment. And so you can see in this picture that there are hanging lights. The teacher's not using the fluorescent lights. There's a little lamp. There's some pillows on the ground instead of having to sit in a desk. There's a little stool. There's some cubbies. So it really makes it more of a home type of feel rather than just a very stark contrasted classroom. And this can be really beneficial for that child to feel safe and comfortable and relaxed in this environment. So some solutions to help teachers really be prepared to help children that have experienced trauma is to start implementing universal screenings for all students, basically using the ACEs questionnaire to really start addressing which students are going to be more at risk for those outbursts or those behaviors that we really need to be taking into consideration whenever we address them and whenever we're helping them in class. So this was conducted by Weedico's Children's Services up in a few schools in the Northeast, and they found that it was successful to provide students with support whenever they had been identified by those screeners. And that they were also helping the teachers kind of understand the process because they were training them on how to use that screener. So it was beneficial for both the teachers and the children in that case. Really just providing teachers on with trainings on how to address those cognitive, behavioral, and social emotional outcomes and those different things that children exhibit whenever they have endured a trauma. Um, that's going to at least help them in their classroom and decrease the likelihood of them being expelled or suspended and increase the likelihood of them being successful in their homework, things like that. Adding trauma-specific staff to schools, it's really expensive, but having a psychologist on staff or a counselor that is trained in trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy can be extremely beneficial. And then also having multi-tiered systems of support um, that can really be beneficial to, again, identifying the kids that need support and then providing that support through different stages. So the multi-tiered systems of support was implemented in a school in Philadelphia, and it was really focusing on early prevention and intervention for children. So basically, there was a universal screening that was used, and mental health professionals were there to implement that, and it addressed academic, behavioral, and mental health domains. So they basically established and figured out if any of the kids were at risk for certain behaviors because of traumatic events that had occurred, or if they were more likely to have like anxiety or depression, things like that. And it really developed a way for them to reduce the amount of inconsistencies in screenings and to really focus on the kids that needed that early intervention. So there were a couple of downsides. It's expensive and it required a lot of training and resources for those mental health professionals and trainings for the teachers. But it was found to be substantially or significantly a positive outcome for the kids that were involved in that. So in order to make these solutions more sustainable, we need to have the administration support. First and foremost, if the teachers don't feel supported, they are less likely to be implementing these different interventions, and they're going to get burnt out a little bit quicker or endure secondhand trauma. And it's really important to provide ongoing trainings and continuing education for teachers and staff who are involved with children. And it's trainings about those different behavioral outcomes or just child abuse and neglect in general. And then it's also important that we start increasing and focusing on the support for school mental health professionals and different resources for mental health in schools so that we can start providing early intervention services for these kids. So in conclusion, trauma is everywhere and it's very common, so we need to be having our teachers trained to be able to help those children in school that are having issues because of trauma. Solutions are going to be hard. They're not necessarily sustainable, but screenings are a great way to start. So having a universal screening to start identifying the kids that need early interventions can be very beneficial to helping stop this cycle. So thank you for listening to my presentation.